Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our now reading through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to passage number 36 of Song of Myself. Now this is a continuation of passage 35. So if you weren't with us for passage 35, I very much recommend go to the description box, find the link that will take you to the lecture on 35. Watch that one first, and that will make a whole lot more sense then for you to hang with us in 36. Now, in 35 we made the observation. It is, of course, a famous mantra of 303 that fundamentally we are, to speak in ontological and epistemological terms, we are, in fact, the stories that we tell, the stories we retell. We're also the stories that we decide to accept, or the stories, of course, that we decide to reject. Whitman, of course, was very much often about those rejection of those stories in his iconoclastic voice. We also mentioned in the previous two lectures the question of cultural theodicy. That is to say, the last of our big five. My assumption is you have been with us for earlier lectures to know what I'm talking about here. The last of our big five is theodicy, the question of evil or pain or suffering in the world. Now obviously you can ask that, why did this happen to me? Or we can ask this question as a group of people, why did this happen to us? And as we've said, Whitman's theodicic project is to learn. He challenges us to stop asking the question, why did this happen to me? And learn to ask, why did this happen for me? Now we are in sections, broadly speaking, 26 through 38. As we qualified it in earlier lectures, the poet's microscopic vision, moving from the ordinary to the mystical. And now we're finishing a smaller section of 34, 35, 36, where there's a certain kind of identification with American history and the patriotism that will be a part of Whitman's celebration of democracy. I have reminded you again and again in these lectures that from passage 4, this line that's so significant, both in and out of the game, and watching and wondering at it, I witness and wait. We're going to see more of that. We're going to see some things that he witnesses here that are disturbing. Let's just get that out of the way right now. This is one of those poems in Leaves of Grass that when you finish it, you kind of do one of these numbers like, ooh. Okay, we're going to get there in a moment. Now my assumption, I've been referencing it, now we can say it out loud. My assumption is you've been with us at learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our playlist for this series of talks. My assumption is you were with us for the 24 poems of inscriptions. We're actually going to reference one of those poems here in a little bit, to The Old Cause, as well as the 19 sections of Paumanok, starting from Paumanok, as well as the previous 35 poems of Song of Myself, especially that intro lecture, which is provided for you as well in the descriptions box. Now, just to remind, we in passage 35, right, we had a really interesting description of a sea battle. Now we're going to get kind of the terrible aftermath of that. It's going to be pretty brutal. What happens in war? Well, there's the war, and then there's the cleanup after the war for those who have survived. We're going to get that here in this project, right? Do you remember that in passage 33, that amazing catalog passage, we heard this line, agonies are one of my changes of garments, end quote. Watch in this poem how we will move from the sea battle of the Revolutionary War and already get ready for the tragedy that will become a few years after the 1855 release of Leaves of Grass for the first time, the great catastrophe of the American Civil War. Let's just read the poem now. Passage 36. Stretched and still lies the midnight. Two great holes motionless on the breast of the darkness. Our vessel riddled and slowly sinking. Preparations to pass to the one we've conquered. The captain on the quarterdeck coldly giving his orders through a countenance white as a sheet. Nearby, the corpse of the child that served in the cabin, the dead face of an old salt with long white hair and carefully curled whiskers. The flames, spite of all that can be done, flickering aloft and below. The husky voices of the 2 or 3 officers yet fit for duty. Formless stacks of bodies and bodies by themselves, dabs of flesh upon the masts and spars, cut of cordage, dangle of rigging, slight shock of the soothe of waves, black and impassive guns, litter of powder parcels, strong scent, a few large stars overhead, silent and mournful shining, delicate sniffs of sea breeze, smells of sedgy grass and fields by the shore, death messages given in charge to survivors, the hiss of the surgeon's knife, the gnawing teeth of his saw, wheeze, cluck, swash of falling blood, short, wild scream, and long, dull, tapering groan. These so, these irretrievable. Now, it is a disturbing poem, and it is, of course, an image of what it looks like when body parts have been blown apart in war, when men are dealing with the loss of limbs and the amputation. Whitman saw a lot of this, and we're going to say more about this later in Leaves of Grass when we meet Drum Taps. He saw a lot. Of course, the Civil War was known as the War of Amputation. We're going to obviously be focusing on the body and the loss of the body as we work through this set of lines. Now let's go to work with it. Notice we begin with the elided verb, streaked and still. Notice how the use of the word still over and over again in Leaves of Grass happens. Lies the midnight. The 1855, by the way, it was lay the midnight. And now notice we're still, it's a continuation of the previous set of lines. Toward 12, there in the beams of the moon, they surrender to us. That's hurrah, high five. But now we have to deal with the tragic aftermath. Two great holes, that's the two ships from 35, motionless on the breast of the darkness. This breast makes us think of Wordsworth's sonnet, when the world is too much with us, right? In that idea, this sea that bears her bosom to the moon. I think Whitman learned a lot from his study of Wordsworth. Our, notice the pronoun our vessel, the winner, in other words, riddled and slowly sinking. In other words, there's no way to save it. Preparations to pass. We think of the evolutionary observations we've already been making in Leaves of Grass, to the one we've conquered. In other words, the conquered vessel will now become the vessel for the conquerors, as the conqueror's vessel will sink to the bottom of the ocean. That is an interesting word picture in itself. We're back then to the captain of 35, and of course, oh captain, my captain, later in Leaves of Grass. But notice it's not the little captain of passage 35, John Paul Jones. The captain on the quarterdeck, coldly, earlier in the previous poem it was serene, now it's coldly, giving his orders through a countenance white as a sheet. It's interesting, the number, and you can read this for yourself and see it. It's interesting the few number of actual cliches we have in Leaves of Grass. Here is one of them, white as a sheet. We don't have a lot of this from Whitman, but there it is. And then notice the genius of Whitman one more time. He goes from the universal, from the big picture, down to the very specific. And we saw this in earlier poems. Here, for example, a young 17-year-old, right? Here now, we'll see it in a small child. Notice nearby, the corpse of the child. And immediately we think, of course, of Song of Myself, passage number 6, when the child fetches the grass, asking, what is this? Whitman's going to point out that when the child is holding grass in his hand, asking, what is this, to the teacher? The teacher could easily say, you're holding yourself. Oh, no. You are the grass. And someday when you die, you're buried in the ground. And what grows out of the ground? The grass. You're holding yourself. The child's corpse here, notice. The child that served in the cabin, so has a relationship to the captain. Then from here, specifically, we move to another face. The dead face of an old salt, that is to say, a mariner, with long white hair. We definitely think of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. We also think of images of Whitman. I mean, all you got to do is Google image Whitman, and you'll notice that he has these long white hair and carefully curled whiskers. We're going to see some of that even in pictures of Whitman. It's his eye, his genius poetic eye, that notice it's carefully, pay attention to all the adverbs, carefully curled whiskers. We're back to flames again, spite of all that can be done, flickering aloft and below. So in other words, we got flames going on here. Notice how the eye of Whitman brings you in. So you literally are there in the scene. The husky voices of the 2 or 3 officers yet fit for duty. Notice the sadness of all of this. And we think of duty, we think obviously of our Immanuel Kant, don't we? Formless stacks of bodies and bodies. Notice it's not just bodies, it's bodies and bodies. By themselves, left alone, right? Well, think of drum taps when we come back to this, when we're in drum taps. And then that disturbing, in the 55 version, he utilizes his ellipses really well. Here it's just a comma, notice. Dabs of flesh. Now we've got the poet of the broken body, right? Dabs of flesh upon the masts and spars. Because of the explosion, body parts are all over the ship as the ship is sinking, right? It's a disturbing image, right? Disturbing image. And then notice the use of quick one monosyllabic words, cut of cordage, dangle of rigging, slight shock of the soothe of waves. In the middle of all this mayhem, the survivors go, wow, the waves are soothing. Now we immediately think of Crane and Red Badge of Courage. Think of it. 1895 is when Crane publishes, having never seen any battles of the American Civil War. We've given lectures on this at Learn Strong. And the naturalism that is a part of that. Notice the use of colorization. Earlier it was white as a sheet. Now it's black and impassive guns. We're going to be irretrievable after impassive later. Litter of powder parcels. And then he goes to the next scent. Strong scent. Right to the next sense. Right? All 5 of the senses elicited so powerfully in Leaves of Grass. A few large stars over here. We're back to the stars of 35. Silent and mournful shining. That is to say, we're back to moonlight and the stars. Delicate, look at all your adjectives here. Delicate sniffs, we're back to smelling, of sea breeze, smells of sedgy grass. By this sedgy word makes us think immediately of 3, of course, of our Keats. Right? And notice grass. Here we are, back to our grass again, leaves of grass. And fields by the shore. They're off the coast of England, right? Death messengers given in charge to survivors. It's as if nature itself is speaking to the survivors to say, this must be. Right? And, of course, we'll think of Sarah Teasdale and, of course, the way in which that poem that will then become Ray Bradbury's story, There Will Come Soft Rains, has to be mentioned at 3A, all of that. Notice the onomatopoeia of so many of the words of Leaves of Grass. The hiss of the surgeon's knife, and of course here we're talking about amputation, right? And in the time in which this will take place, it's even more barbaric than it will be during Whitman's own time. In the Civil War, it was very barbaric. The hiss of the surgeon's knife, the gnawing teeth, notice again your adjectives, the gnawing teeth of his saw. Wow, think about our comments on Frost's Out, and the saw that cuts off, of course, the boy's arm and ultimately his life. Obviously, Frost spent a lot of time studying a passage like this, right? We gave full lecture on that at Learn Strong as well. In the 55 version, it's the wheeze, but now it's just wheeze, cluck, swash. I've told you to read T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, you got to read Whitman. Go back and study that dry salvages lines, clangs the bell. Here it's wheeze, cluck, swash. This is American poetry. You're not going to hear stuff like this in British poetry as much as in American poetry. Swash of falling blood. Then you have the short, wild scream and long, dull, tapering groan. Go back to Frost's Out and just pay attention to the way he learned to play that game, I think, from a passage like this. The last line of this poem is some of the most amazing words written in Leaves of Grass. You've got this really, really disturbing scene, right? You got body parts all over a boat that's going down. You got bodies stacked up that are dead. You got live people that are losing now parts of their body to amputation, and they scream wildly and then they groan as they're passing out from pain. All of that follows by this line. These irretrievable. Now I want to say 2 things for your notes about this at 2B. First of all, the word so is followed here by a comma in the deathbed edition. In the 55 edition, it was ellipsis, and I think it works better. I think Whitman outthought himself on this, because You want to pause after the word so. These so. What would we say? Sad? What would we say? So beautiful? What would we say? So full of anguish? I mean, there's so many ways you would follow the word so. And then these. Irretrievable. It's over. There's no undoing what has been done. There's no putting the body parts back on the people who are dead or half dead. It's a compelling way for Whitman to say, in his pacifist voice, as, of course, his Quaker background would provide him that pacifist voice. This is what war does. This is what war does. Let's jump now quickly to 2a. Well, obviously, war is hell, right? And it's such a waste of human life. But I think there is this collective or this cultural theodicy that's in play in Leaves of Grass, right? That is to say, war is sometimes necessary. This is the Revolutionary War, and it had to happen so that, of course, America could have its freedom, the colonists could have their freedom. At 2b, we've talked about the use of colors, the powerful adverbs, coaly, sedgy, adverbs and adjectives. The word choice, wheezes, clucks, swat of blood, right? Now, we're going to hear more about this at 3a. We're going to hear more about this in drum taps, so just put it in your notes at 3a. We're going to come back to this, bodies and amputations and piles of limbs and all of that. What about this one, though? You remember when we met to thee, O cause, thou peerless, passionate, good cause, thou stern, remorseless, sweet idea. Do you remember that he says, thou orb of many orbs, thou seeding principle, thou well-kept latent germ, thou center, around the idea of thee, the war revolving? With all its angry and vehement play of causes, with vast results to come for thrice 1,000 years, these recitatives for thee, my book and the war are one. That's what he said at the beginning of Leaves of Grass. He's kind of proving it now. Do you remember in passage 15, what is removed drops horribly in the pail? That's those echoes of the amputation. It drops horribly into the pail. Just these echoes. What about the whole idea of how Whitman loves to play around with the ancient epic tradition? So, for example, notice you hear resonances here of the Iliad and the Aeneid. Now, we've given full lectures, of course, on all of this, but I just want to go back to the opening lines. We're playing around with Robert Fagel's translation here of the Iliad. Hear it again. Rage, goddess. Sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles. Murderous doom that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighter souls, but made their bodies carry on feasts for the dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was moving towards its end, as we have said. The theodicy question of the Iliad is, who's to blame for all of the death? The answer? Well, it's really Achilles and his rage. Unless, of course, it's Zeus, because you got to blame everything in the end on the gods, which is why we read the Odyssey. And, of course, Homer says at the beginning, you can't blame it on the gods, because Zeus says humans make their own choices about why terrible things happen in war. It's an interesting debate. Of course, Crane's Red Badge of Courage as well. Finally, at 3b, hey, what is the worst thing you've ever had to witness? And if you were to describe it, what kind of adjectives that would solicit all 5 of the senses would come into play? Hey, if you want to be a good writer, you got to be a good reader. And you got to read the right kind of stuff. And what is it that we say about good writers? They show. They don't tell. Think about the way Whitman plays that game. Try to emulate it in your own writing. And I hope that you're really growing, not just as a reader here, but also as a writer as we continue our talks with Walt. Thank you.